The Adventures of Superman, Panic in the Sky, December 5th, 2007. Everyone in Metropolis was out in the streets watching a mysterious shadow over the sky. It was near dusk, but something was alarming the people of Metropolis, but not only Metropolis, the entire world. The world was in a panic as a massive asteroid was orbiting near the Earth. The asteroid had no name, but as the scientists on television and radio were saying, it was 10 miles wide and 10 miles long, and if it would crash on Earth, it would wipe out all life. Well, in the office of the Daily Planet building, Jimmy and Lois were looking out the window up in the sky, and Jimmy says to Lois, "Gee, Miss Lane, why is it dark suddenly?" And then Lois answers Jimmy, "Well, because the asteroid is passing in front of the sun." And then Jimmy says to Lois, "Lois, don't tell anyone. I'm scared." And then Lois says to Jimmy, "It's okay, Jimmy. I'm frightened too." Then Perry White comes storming into the office, screaming, "Where the Sam Hills Kent at?" And then Lois turns around to answer Mr. White, "Well, Mr. White, I don't know. Nobody knows." And then Lois goes on to say to Perry White, "Maybe Clark has found a bunker where he's hiding out at to ride out this disaster." And then White screams, "And what about Superman? No one's heard from him either." And Jimmy says, "Well, no one's seen Superman since this thing was beginning." And suddenly, the chief receives a text message. The chief pulls out his flip phone and looks at the text message, and he says to the two in the office, "It's from Clark." And Mr. White proceeds to read the text message out loud to the two reporters. He reads, "Dear Mr. White, I'm out on the streets covering the people's reaction to the impending disaster. I just hope that Superman's able to save us all. Godspeed, Clark Kent." Jimmy says, "Well, Chief, that answers our question where he's at." And then Jimmy heads back out to the window to look up in the sky, and then he says to Lois and Perry White, "Golly, I don't see it anymore." And then Lois walks over to the window and sticks her head out, and she looks into the sky, and she says to Jimmy, "Well, because it's in the shadow of the Earth, it's so close to us." And then she turns to look at the chief and she says, "Mr. White, do we have anything new?" And then Perry looks at his paperwork in his hands and he says to them, "No, nothing new. Just this and that. Let's see here. A lot of churches in the United States and other religious temples are offering prayer service in hopes of deflecting that asteroid, and that's it." Then Lois asks Perry White, "Well, Mr. White, do you want to get a extra out? Possibly release pictures of that thing or an artist impression?" And then Perry White says to Lois, "No, we'll put it out with the morning wind-up story, if there is a morning." Then Jimmy was about to say something when he was suddenly stopped at the sight of bright light coming in through the open window. Him, Lois, and the chief run to the open window to look outside, and then they saw a bright object in the sky that was bright almost as day. And then Jimmy says, "Golly, I don't think that's the moon. Neither is it the sun." And then Perry White says, "No, that's the asteroid. The light of the sun is hitting it." Then Lois says, "Dear God in heaven, look at that size of that thing." And then Perry White says, "If you excuse me, I gotta phone my wife and talk to my daughter." And the chief quickly darts out of the office. Meanwhile, at the Rosemary Hill Observatory, it was one of the very few telescopes in the state of Florida, since the state of Florida has really no high ground. And the telescope was outside observing that giant asteroid. In the observatory was a typical astronomer. He was about 60. He had thin white hair and a thin white goatee and mustache that connected to the goatee. He was about average height, thin build, and he was looking at that asteroid with a deep concern in his face. He takes his eyes out of the viewer and then he goes towards the exit. One man comes through the exit asking, "Professor, any change?" The old professor quickly brushes him aside and steps out to the balcony where there was a group of men that were there also waiting. And then the astronomer screams, "Superman! Superman, where are you?" And then the professor goes through the telescope room again and exits through the other exit to the other end of the balcony, and he screams, "Superman, where are you?" And then Superman screams, "I'm over here, Professor. I'm just watching it." Then the professor walks over to Superman, and he says to Superman, "I'm sure your eyes are doing a better job than a telescope." And then Superman says to the professor, "It stopped moving, sir." And the old professor says to Superman, "Well, because it's heading right for Earth now." And Superman says, "What?" And then the professor says, "Yes, it is." And then Superman says to the professor, "Excuse me, sir, I have a date in outer space." And then the professor puts his hands on Superman's chest and he says, "Superman, don't try it." And then Superman says, "I have to. Maybe I can fly fast enough and crash against it and knock it off its course." And then the professor says to Superman, "Well, you don't know how your powers function in space. Plus, we have spectroscopic images of that thing, and there's minerals and gases of unknown origin. You're taking an awful big risk, Superman," says the old professor. And he goes on to say to Superman, "What if that thing is a giant chunk of kryptonite or some sort of unknown element that you don't know may harm you?" And then Superman says, "Well, Professor, that's a risk I have to take." And then Superman quickly jumps in the air and flies off. The professor looks at Superman taking off, and he says aloud to himself, "Chance, that's all that is, a chance." Soon, Superman was flying straight towards the asteroid as he was finally reaching space. Superman had reached a velocity that he's never reached before. He couldn't fathom it, and neither was he worried about how fast he was flying, but he was flying faster than he's ever had flown before. Finally, Superman collided head-on with that huge asteroid. The world watched on as Superman succeeded in stopping the asteroid dead in its tracks, but also because of the speed that he was flying, the impact shattered the asteroid, causing the shattered pieces to rain down on Earth as a meteor shower, giving a spectacular light show to all across the eastern seaboard of the US. Meanwhile, on Earth, everybody was celebrating that they were not going to die. And in the Daily Planet office, it was a madhouse as everyone was scrambling to get everything ready for the morning edition. White was on the phone, and then he hangs up the phone and it's like, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, each one of us owes our life to Superman." And then he goes on to say, "I just got off the phone with the Rosemary Observatory. The old professor there told me that the asteroid has quit moving. It's not going to hit Earth. It's now going to orbit Earth as a second moon." And then the chief goes on to say to the people, "And now the asteroid's also been reduced in size. Now it's only 5 miles long and 5 miles wide." Meanwhile, in orbit, Superman had lost consciousness from the impact. The gravity of the planet began to pull him in as he was entering the atmosphere as a great fireball. He soon crashed right into Metropolis's suicide slum in a back alley. Superman emerged from the impact crater he made. He was disoriented with a very bad headache. And then he changes back into Clark Kent. Clark emerges from the back alley and a car pulls up to him. It was an older model, silver convertible, and there was a young man driving it, and he says, "Wow, man, did you see that? I thought we were all goners. Man, thank God for Superman. He saved us all." And then he goes on to say to Clark, "Well, it looks like I get to spend time with my family this Christmas again." And then he asks Clark, "Hey, what's wrong with you, man?" And then Clark says, "Oh, man, I don't know. I got a very bad headache. Oh, can you give me a lift back to my apartment?" And then the young man says, "Sure, where do you live at?" So Clark tells him where he lives at, and then he gets into the convertible and the man drives off. Later, Clark reaches his apartment. He had a very bad headache. The disorientation was seen to be getting worse. And then when he goes into his bedroom and he takes off his business suit, he sees the Superman costume underneath it, and he was perplexed. Why was he wearing this? So he takes off the costume and then puts on a robe, and then he hears a knock on the door. Clark walks over to the door and opens it up, and it was Jimmy. And then Jimmy says, "Mr. Kent, where have you been? The chief is wondering where you are. He needs your public's reaction story so he could put it in the morning edition of the paper." Clark says, "Oh, okay, Jimmy, just come in, have a seat. I'm going to take a quick shower," he says to Jimmy. And then Jimmy's like, "Mr. Kent, you don't look well. You're pallid." Then Clark says, "Oh, I don't know what happened. I remember Suicide Slum. Let me take a shower. I got a very bad headache, like a migraine." And then Clark walks into the bathroom. Jimmy sits in the chair to wait for Clark. He was looking through Clark's reading materials that were by his chair. They were mainly electronics magazines, car magazines, and a couple of Batman comic books. Then, as Jimmy was waiting and waiting, he suddenly heard the loud sound of glass breaking. Jimmy screams, "Mr. Kent!" And then he runs over to the bathroom and sees that Clark fell through the glass of the shower door, and Jimmy quickly turns off the shower and had to be very cautious with the slippery floor and all the broken glass all over the place. He quickly looked over the nude Clark and was surprised that there was no cuts. There was no blood. Jimmy was very shocked that Clark did not get mutilated falling through the glass door. So he helps Clark up to his feet. Clark was, "Oh, my head. Jimmy quickly walks Clark over to the toilet, sits him down, grabs the robe, and puts it over Clark and guides Clark to the bed. Then he quickly dials the chief and Lois. As Clark was unconscious, he was having a very vivid and trippy nightmare. And then when Clark was regaining consciousness, he could hear his friends talking. He could hear Lois saying, "How in the world did this man not get sliced to ribbons falling through that glass door?" And then Jimmy says to Lois, "I guess he's the luckiest man in the world, Miss Lane." All three of them quickly noticed that Clark was regaining consciousness, with Lois asking Clark, "Clark, are you okay?" Clark says yes, rubbing the back of his head. And then Mr. White asks Clark, "Clark, what was going on?" And then Clark says, "Well, sir, all I remember was Suicide Slum. I remember I wrote the story of the public reaction, and then it's right there at my desk," he said, pointing to the desk. And then he goes on to say, "Then that's all I remember was going to Suicide Slum. And then I regained consciousness in there in a back alley." And then Mr. White says, "Well, that answers it. You probably went to Suicide Slum and you got yourself mugged. They hit you over the head and they probably took your wallet." And then Jimmy says, "I'm glad you're okay, Mr. Kent. You're super lucky to fall through that shower door and not get killed." And then Clark says, "You're right, Jimmy." And then Lois asks the $1,000,000 question, "Clark, have you seen Superman?" And then Clark says, "Well, I haven't seen Superman since this whole ordeal started." Then Clark noticed the look of worry in Lois's face. And then Clark says, "Lois, don't worry. Superman can take care of himself. Maybe he's recovering from saving us all." And then Lois is like, "You're probably right, Clark. Oh, sure, he'll show up in a couple days when he's feeling better." A couple days had passed since Superman saved the world. And now that asteroid was just the second moon orbiting the Earth. And everyone was just going about their days in the city of Metropolis. Meanwhile, in the Daily Planet, it was business as usual in the newsroom. Lois walks up to Clark's desk, and she asks Clark, "Clark, anything on Superman?" Clark said, "No, Lois, for the last time. I haven't seen or heard of him since the whole asteroid incident started. And if he wants to contact me, he will contact me, said Clark sternly to Lois. Lois said, all right, all right. Sorry I asked, and she walked off. Clark had no memory of being his alter ego Superman. In fact, the story he was typing up was titled, Where is Superman? Then Clark stops typing the story. As he clutches his head, he had another sharp headache that came on all of a sudden. Jimmy walks up to him and says, Mr. Kent, you have another of those headaches of yours? Clark says, yes. Oh, man. Then the headache went away. And then Clark says, oh, I gotta go to the doctor, Jimmy. I gotta get rid of these headaches. And then Jimmy says, well, hopefully you can get to a doctor soon. What all of this that's going on, he says to Clark. And Clark said, what's going on? And then Jimmy says, you haven't seen the news, Clark? There was a massive tornado in Egypt near the pyramids. It was an EF5 in Egypt. And that's not the only thing. There seems to be wacky weather going on all over the earth. And Clark says to Jimmy, really? And Jimmy says, yeah, back to Clark. And he goes on to explain to Clark, oh, there's very, very bad blizzards up north. The Pacific seems to have a big volcanic eruption going on. And I mean, like, record numbers. Even Hawaii is experiencing record volcanic eruptions, he says to Clark. And then, suddenly, the building began to shake. As quick as it happened, the tremor stopped. The lights in the rooms were still flickering on and off, and everyone was panicked. Jimmy says to Clark, wow, Clark, did you see that? An earthquake in Florida. I wonder how strong that was. Clark says to Jimmy, this is not good, Jimmy. This is not good at all. Then Perry White comes out of his office screaming for everyone to come to his office. He was calling an emergency meeting. Inside the cramped editor's office, everyone was standing, listening to Perry White tell what was going on, and he says, all right, people, listen good. The NASA guys are saying that this asteroid is causing all the disturbances around the planet, from the earthquakes to that massive tsunami in Central America to all the violent weather across the world. And if nothing's done to the asteroid soon, let's just say I don't want to think about it. And then White starts assigning people to the different aspects of the story. Then when he gets to Clark, he screams, Kent, anything on Superman? And Clark answers back, Perry White, no, sir, I haven't heard of anything from Superman in a week. Sir, I don't know if he's alive or dead, and I fear the worst. And then Perry White says to Clark, Kent, the only job you have right now in this assignment is to find Superman and make sure he's alright, and then tell him to get his butt in gear and save us. Clark says, yes, sir, Mr. White. And then after White dismisses the meeting, everyone noticed that it got dark outside, and a violent storm was rolling in. It wasn't like any storm front that was rolling in. Everyone noticed that it got dark as night outside, and the lightning bolts coming from that storm cloud was very scary looking. Clark quickly left the office and left his job. He went back home to his apartment, and he had begun to look for clues to the whereabouts of Superman, not knowing that he is Superman. As he had searched everything just to find out who Superman was, he decided to go to his closet and pull out the costume. And he always wondered what the heck was he doing wearing the costume the night that Superman stopped the asteroid from hitting the Earth. So Clark went and put on the costume and looked in the mirror, and he saw himself in a very familiar light, like something was missing. So Clark quickly took a brush and brushed his hair forward, the way Superman has his hair brushed. Then Clark was remembering something in the back of his mind. Ellesmere Island, big fortress in Ellesmere Island, belongs to Superman. And then Clark quickly takes off the Superman costume, gets into his normal clothes, and gets to the telephone. He calls the airport to see if he can get a flight to Canada, but there were so few airplanes in the air, he had to get to Ellesmere Island. But after an hour, he found one plane that was doing a flight to Canada, and because of the situation, they were charging an arm and a leg. So for the first time ever since he joined the Daily Planet, Clark decided to use the Daily Planet expense account to pay for this flight. Then, after he hangs up the phone, he calls the chief and he says, "Mr. White, listen, there is a way I may be able to find Superman. I don't know if it's going to succeed or not. If it doesn't, sir, I want you to know it was a very great pleasure to work for the Daily Planet, and thank you so much, sir, for giving me this job." Mr. White told Clark, "Well, Clark, you're the best reporter that I ever had, but don't tell that to Lois if you survive." Clark says to Perry White, "Don't worry, sir, your secret's safe with me." Then he hangs up the phone and starts packing. He finally gets the flight out to Canada. The airplane landed in Toronto, and Clark was able to make his way to Ellesmere Island. It was a long and arduous journey, wrought with peril from the weather going out of control. Well, finally, he made it to the Fortress of Solitude. Clark said to himself out loud, "This definitely has to be the place where Superman is at." So he walks up a cleverly hidden staircase to the giant bronze goldish colored door, and then he wondered how he was going to get inside, or at least get Superman's attention. Then he realized something. He remembered something in the back of his mind, some sort of handprint scanner. Clark wondered if it worked for him, if he was truly Superman's friend. So Clark puts his hand on a section of the door, and of course it glowed as was reading his handprint. Soon the massive door opened. Clark quickly runs inside, screaming Superman's name as he saw one of the robotic servitors fly by him. Then Keelix floats up to Clark, and he says to Clark,
"Master Kal-El, welcome back. How may I assist you?"
Confused, Clark says, "Oh no, you must have me confused with Superman. I am Clark Kent, I am Superman's friend, and I'm looking for him. It's very urgent." Keelix, quickly sensing something was wrong, did a medical scan, and he picked up that Clark had recently been injured. And then he says to Clark,
"Master Kal-El, my medical scans read that you recently have been injured."
Clark was confused, but Keelix explained to Clark everything as he was taking him to the infirmary. There in the infirmary, Clark was scanned by some sort of scanning beam, and then Keelix says to him that he had been injured by a huge exposure to kryptonite. And then he told Clark to lay down on the bed, and soon another beam was scanning over Clark, treating every injury that he had experienced from that kryptonite exposure. The final part was to fix his memory, and another beam that was more concentrated was beamed directly into Clark's head, repairing his brain, and he now regained his full memory back. Now he knew who he fully was. And then Clark gets up from the bed and he says, "My God, Keelix, the Earth is in trouble." And Keelix reveals to Clark that they've been monitoring that asteroid for quite a while, and they inform Clark also that the asteroid's composition was mostly kryptonite. And then Clark says to Keelix, "Well, Keelix, I'm going to need something to protect me." And Keelix informed Clark that they have just the thing to help him destroy that asteroid. And Keelix took Clark to the hangar bay in the Fortress of Solitude. There, among all the vehicles in the hangar bay, was a Kryptonian fighter that was being prepared by the servitor robots. And then Clark also noticed at the corner of his eye that another group of servitor robots were working on some sort of missile. And then Keelix informed Clark that that is a plasma warhead, and that will be powerful enough to destroy the asteroid. And Clark tells Keelix, "Tell me when it's ready." And Clark leaves the hangar bay, and then Clark proceeds to change into his Superman costume. When he comes back to the hangar bay, the fighter was ready. Superman gets in to the cockpit, closes the canopy, and a platform raises the fighter outside. And then Superman hits a few buttons and then takes off in the fighter.
The engine is starting up. 3, 2, 1.
Soon the fighter was in orbit, in an intercept course with that giant asteroid. Superman sees it and readies the plasma warhead missile. After it was ready, Superman fires it, and the plasma warhead missile hits the asteroid, burying itself inside the asteroid, and then there was a massive explosion. The asteroid was destroyed. There were one or two big chunks left that Superman saw was disintegrating quickly, and the smaller, tinier pieces began to rain down on Earth. They will be completely disintegrated by the atmosphere. And Superman flies the fighter back to the Fortress of Solitude. He was victorious. And the Daily Planet headline the next day read, "Superman saves Earth again from asteroid." Story by Lois Lane. 2 nights later, in some swamp somewhere in Florida, a figure wades through the marshy water until he finds a small crater. There was a giant chunk of meteorite. The figure had a hard hat on with a flashlight on it, and then with his gloved hands, he picks up the chunk of meteorite, and he starts chiseling it away with a small chiseling hammer. And then he breaks out a Geiger counter and scans it. The figure puts away the Geiger counter, and then he takes a small flashlight and turns it on. There was no light coming out from it, but he still shines it onto the chiseled away part of the meteorite, and then it began to glow green. And the figure says aloud, "Excellent kryptonite." Like and subscribe. The end.